At roughly mid-morning on August 4th, 1892, a domestic hush that had settled over a respectable house in Fall River was broken by a single, high cry. It came from a young woman who did the household's work, a sound that in an ordinary house would have summoned sympathy or scolding. In this house, it summoned the town. Within hours, the neat parlor and the tidy rooms that kept the family's composure would be measured like a ledger. Entries made in blood and shadow, and a single question would outlive the courtroom. Did Lizzie Borden kill her parents? Ledger. Narrative device. August 4th, 1892. Household, tidy. Ledgers, balanced. Silence, present. Anomalies. Indefinido. That ledger line is not a primary document. It is a small, fictional notation. A way to read the order the Bordens cultivated. Accounts closed, rooms kept exact, reputations conserved. The real records, newspaper pages, inquest notes, remembered testimony, are separate things. But the ledger image helps us track how a family that kept its books so carefully also kept certain things unspoken. It is the interplay between the domestic ledger and the body count that organizes this story, the arithmetic of property, the accounting of time, the margins where social performance meets private fracture. Fall River at the end of the 19th century was a town of looms and smoke, an industrial place where cotton mills stitched the community into layers. The mills drew a crowded human spill of immigrants and native New Englanders, and the rhythm of work, 12-hour shifts, neat paydays, imprinted on neighborhood life. With industry came wealth for a few, and in this town that wealth translated into visible domestic order, fine houses with parlors kept for callers, well-tended porches, and an insistence on appearances that could be policed by neighbors as easily as by family. Andrew Jackson Borden was one of those men for whom order translated into public standing. By the time of his death, he was a property owner and an investor in Fall River's commercial life. He had a reputation for thrift, so pronounced that it became part of how townsfolk spoke of him, and a conservative approach to money that, to contemporaries, suggested a particular kind of control. That frugal habit, more than a quirk, shaped how his household operated. Economies of domestic staffing, meticulous household margins, and a manner of living that emphasized propriety. Abby Durfee Borden, commonly called Abby, occupied the house's social center. As matron, she kept the household calendar, received callers, and upheld the family's public face. She had been Andrew's second wife, and her role included the invisible labor that Victorian New England required, hosting small social rituals, supervising servants, and making sure the rooms looked as if nothing was wrong. To the neighbors, she was a hostess, which is to say, she was the household's public performance. Lizzie and Emma Borden, the daughters who lived at home, presented themselves within that ordered drama. They were, in different ways, embodiments of the household ledger, precise, reserved, and observant. Lizzie, in the way history remembers her, carried an odd combination. She was competent in domestic affairs, given her place and duties, and also oddly private. She kept to herself. She had close garden habits and a fastidious attention to clothes and appearances, and to the outside eye she was the daughter a respectable family might point to without embarrassment. But private notes and the margins of neighbors' gossip hinted that the pauses in the house's conversation were not always tranquil. There were, in the ledger's margins, disputes about money, about inheritance, about who would manage what if a parent died. How loud those disputes were, whether they were spoken in sharp sentences or recorded only as small entries in a pocketbook, is part of the ambiguity this case preserves. Ledger, narrative device. Andrew, thrifty. Abby, dutiful. Lizzie, precise, private. Emma, steady. Bridget, maid. Newcomer, observant. Notes, family tensions, some documented, many shades of indefinido. The house itself, like any well-kept residence of its class, organized life into rooms that had both function and theater. There were parlors held for callers, parlors that required bows and tea, and private bedrooms upstairs where daily life could be shut behind a door. Stairs and thresholds behave in these stories, as more than architectural elements. They are choke points of testimony. Who passed a threshold and when can be the thin line between alibi and suspicion. A hallway records movement as surely as ledger pages record expenditures, because a house's layout arranges availability. Someone in the kitchen is unlikely to be seen by a caller in the parlor. Someone at the foot of the stairs is within earshot of a conversation on the landing. To understand what happened that morning is to map these thresholds, to imagine where shadows could linger unnoticed and where sounds would travel on a humid August day. The day itself began with ordinary domestic choreography. To reconstruct the morning is to assemble multiple accounts, some scribbled by reporters, some recorded at the inquest, some remembered by neighbors. These records do not form a single perfect timeline. They dovetail and sometimes contradict. Contemporary newspapers printed times that vary by minutes. Witnesses disagreed about who was in the parlor and who had breakfast where. Where matters of minutes are significant, I will note indefinido and point to the fact that sources conflict. On the morning of August 4th, members of the household performed their usual tasks. The maid, Bridget, often called Bridget Sullivan, or by variant spellings in the papers, was a young woman newly in the house, a servant whom the family had employed to help maintain order. She moved through the rooms, sweeping, tending fires, and making the small notations of domestic labor that would have been familiar to any household servant. Where linens were kept, which window needed mending, which curtains were drawn for the sun. Emma and Lizzie had their routines, attending to letters, to callers, to the day's arrangements. Andrew, for his part, had errands and appointments, business that sent him in and out of the house. What followed that morning is relatively straightforward in its broad shape, but stubbornly defiant when it comes to precise timing. Sometime in the late morning, 2 members of the household were discovered dead under circumstances that made little sense at first glance. One body was found downstairs, the other upstairs. Both had suffered multiple blows that proved fatal. That bare statement of fact, 2 English-speaking people felled in their home, does not capture the shock it produced in a town that measured itself by the cleanliness of its porches. The discovery sequence is a picture assembled from fragmentary reports. In one version, a maid encounters the upper-floor bedroom and finds a woman motionless. In another, neighbors and family members arrive to find discordant scenes on different floors. The details where they matter, who first saw what exactly was said in the first moments, whether a door was locked or open, are points where historians have to place margin notes, indefinido. Ledger, narrative device. Discovery, upstairs. Abby, indefinido time. Downstairs, Andrew, indefinido time. First voice. Bridget, neighbor, exact sequence, indefinido. Neighbors described a sudden grisly change in the house's sounds. The sound of a woman's cry, the rush of bodies, the way a well-kept parlor was suddenly filled with neighbors and constables. News of the deaths moved quickly through Fall River. In an era when newspapers were voracious for startling copy, the killing in a respectable house became material for heated pages, the kind of story that sells both morning and evening editions. Street corners filled with people who had known the Bordens in passing, shopkeepers, mill supervisors, distant cousins, and their reactions became a public barometer of the household's shock. Newspapers, in their early reports, did what newspapers do. They tried to render a coherent account from chaotic information. Their first pages, hot and unverified, served to turn private pain into public property. It is worth pausing to consider this dynamic. The family's grief, the sheriff's procedure, and the press's hunger collided in the space of the parlor. What was once a domestic event, 2 deaths in a single household, transformed into a public spectacle with an economic logic of its own. That transformation shaped the memory of the case as much as any physical evidence. One of the first practical acts after the discovery was the summoning of local authorities to the house. Again, the formalities of 1892 policing matter here. The constabulary of the day conducted inquests, took witness statements, and attempted to preserve evidence. But forensic science, as we understand it today, microscopic analysis, blood pattern interpretation, rigorous chain of custody protocols, was at best rudimentary. Investigators relied on careful note-taking, local medical opinion, and the testimony of those who had been present. The lack of modern forensics means that the case would later be reinterpreted by generations of analysts with tools unavailable to the original investigators. It also means that much of what was decisive in 1892 was narrative: who could be believed, whose account fit the ledger of the household, and which version the jury would accept. By the time authorities arrived, curious neighbors had already begun to make their own inventories, whispering about motives that might explain such sudden violence. The list of possible reasons, as with any such case, clustered around a few predictable themes: money, property, family disputes, and outsiders. Within those themes, people's imaginations supplied details that the law had not yet established. It is worth emphasizing, because it is the moral center of the historical problem, that rumor can often outperform evidence in shaping a case's public life. Where the police took sworn statements and performed cautious examinations, the press and neighbors supplied narratives that sometimes hardened into certainties before the courtroom ever convened. One of the things the early reports noticed, and which would become a recurring piece of the case's public animation, was behavior: gestures, remarks, and small physical signs that seemed, to some observers, to suggest guilt or innocence. The daughters' comportment, how they answered questions, how they greeted neighbors, was scrutinized. A cut on a hand, a tear in a dress, a refusal to weep. These small signs were weighed in the absence of incontrovertible material evidence. That attention to behavior reflected social assumptions about how women of a certain class should act when confronted with grief, and those assumptions would become evidentiary in the public eye, though whether they carried legal weight was another matter. Ledger, narrative device. Behavioral entries: Lizzie, controlled; Emma, composed; Bridget, distressed. Public ledger, rumor entries rising. It bears repeating that contemporaneous observers were working with imperfect data. A watch stopped at one time, a neighbor's clock suggested another. Men remembered gait and timing differently. Where modern readers might expect rigid certainty about who was where at each minute, the surviving record resists such neatness. This is why the inquest, the formal preliminary hearing where witnesses give sworn statements, played such a crucial role. In that hearing, statements were recorded under oath, yet even sworn testimony can disagree with other sworn testimony. Memory is not a ledger in any reliable sense. It is a margin filled with impressions. What the early reports did not and could not do was provide a full technical analysis of the injuries or a methodical reconstruction of the crime scene in the modern sense. Coroners and physicians of the era could note the nature of fatal blows and estimate time of death within broad limits, but they could not, with precision, map the trajectory of every blow or determine definitively who delivered them using blood pattern analysis, because those techniques had not yet matured. Later analysts would point to this absence as one of the case's intractable features. The forensic toolkit of 1892 left gaps that would later be filled by stories rather than by conclusive science. The family's financial circumstances and the question of inheritance rapidly assumed notice in the press. Andrew Borden's frugality and his approach to his estate had been a point of family negotiation. Rumors about the will and who would inherit were among the speculation that swirled. Whether those rumors were grounded in documented legal instruments or in projected anxieties is a matter we will examine in detail, because motive is one of the pillars around which both prosecution and defense would build competing narratives. It is crucial, however, not to let motive become shorthand for guilt. A financial grievance may give someone a reason to wish ill, but it does not by itself provide physical evidence that they acted. Lizzie Borden, accused later, was a woman whose public image complicated any easy reading. She presented as a proper daughter who dressed well, kept her composure, and supervised household order. Yet to the townspeople, and to some historians, that very propriety could be read as abnormal or performative. In a culture in which women were coded as naturally more emotional, a lack of overt grief was often interpreted as something other than restraint. The cultural expectations of the time thus served as a lens through which behavior was interpreted. A stern face might be an ameliorated pain or a sign of guilt. Silence might be forbearance or a calculated stoicism. Ledger, narrative device. Public ledgers, will rumors, witness reports, moral judgments, interpretation, contested. The immediate days after the discovery saw the house transformed. Where before there had been smooth parlor chairs and domesticated routines, now there were constables, visitors, and the soft discipline of an official investigation. The house kept its doors, but could not keep its secrets. People read rooms as if they could be annotated. They compared banal domestic items to the scale of a crime, and they spoke in ways that tried to place an uncanniness into language. All of this, the neighbors' inventories, the maid's statements, the daughter's comportment, would be taken into account at the inquest and later at trial. It is worth pausing to consider one paradox of criminal cases in domestic spaces. The very routines that make a house livable, locked drawers, private letters, the habit of not questioning a parent's decisions, can also make it harder to reconstruct events after the fact. A household's tacit rules, the social ledger that dictates who speaks and who defers, can keep some details forever in the margin. When investigators enter such a space, they are not only conducting a forensic search, they are also encountering a set of social arrangements that can obscure as much as they reveal. There were also practical oddities that would attract notice. Items in the house seemed to be in order in some reports and disordered in others. A burned-out match here, a chair slightly askew there. These small clues were amplified by journalists and neighbors into potential signs. Modern readers must read such details with caution. In a house where servants were expected to tidy quickly and where neighbors were primed for scandal, tiny displacements can be interpreted in multiple conflicting ways. What mattered, in the days after the discovery, was not simply the physical facts of two bodies and a house. It was the social arithmetic that followed. Who would inherit? Who would answer questions? Who had motive? And whose motive would the public find plausible? Those questions animated conversations in shop windows and in editorial rooms, and they would later animate courtroom strategies. In a case where definitive forensic closure was elusive, narrative, who told the better story, became crucial. By late morning, more formal procedures were set in motion. An inquest would be convened, witnesses would be called, and officials would begin the slow work of turning chaotic observations into official statements. The inquest's paperwork, depositions, signed testimonies, correlated witness statements, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case when the authorities moved from local investigation to criminal charges. Yet an inquest, like any human process, was subject to the constraints of the era's police practice, limited forensic tools, local medical opinion, and the interpretive frames of those in white collars who judged behavior. Ledger, narrative device. Procedural entries, inquest called, witnesses to be sworn, evidence catalogue, indefinido pending formal recording. It is important here to acknowledge what is not known with precision. The minute-to-minute choreography of the morning contains variations in source material. The exact time a maid discovered a body, the precise moment neighbors assembled, whether certain doors were locked or open at specific minutes. Where sources diverge, I mark the detail as indefinido. This is not evasion, it is historical caution. The case's enduring fascination rests in part on these lacunae. When there is no single authoritative minute-by-minute account, narrative has room to take hold. That room can be used by lawyers, by journalists, and by storytellers. It can also be a space where the truth is harder to locate. In the first hours after the discovery, the town reconciled two incompatible truths. The Bordens were a household of respectable social standing, and two of its members had been violently killed in their bed and in their parlor. The collision of those facts produced a communal dissonance. For the Bordens' acquaintances, there was the strangeness of seeing what had been a stage for polite social life turned into a theater for tragedy. For authorities, there was the practical task of investigating and the legal task of determining whether a private misfortune had a criminal cause. As the day wore on, The house that had been a tidy ledger began to feel, to observers, like a book opened to an unanticipated page. People assembled stories, and those stories would later be placed under oath and tested for coherence. The first notes were taken. The first edges of the narrative began to harden. In an investigation that would later be narrated through trial transcripts, newspaper repeats, and scholarly essay, the initial hours function as the seedbed of competing interpretations. A final observation about this early scene. When the private becomes public in such a sudden and violent way, the culture supplies its own vocabulary. In the Borden case, that vocabulary included the language of duty and propriety, of inheritance and etiquette, and of what is expected of a daughter in a respectable household. Those expectations provided both a backdrop and a set of measuring sticks. They shaped what people listened for and what they assumed they knew, and they therefore shaped the evidence's reception. Ledger, narrative device, early public ledger, shock entries, curiosity entries, rumor accrual, legal ledger, inquest initiation. If this question, the one at the center of what we have just begun to recount, grabs you, take a moment to cast your vote in the poll below. What do you think happened that morning? Your answer places you among the many who, for more than a century, have tried to balance the household ledgers with the thin, stubborn facts. After that first day, the machinery of legal inquiry took over. Witnesses were called to give sworn statements. A coroner or medical examiner made observations about the nature of the blows and the likely windows for time of death, though such estimates were broad. Neighbors were questioned, servants were asked to recall trivialities now rendered heavy with meaning, and a town that had known the Bordens in days of tea and polite exchange was becoming, unwillingly, the stage for a public drama whose consequences would reach far beyond its porches. The evidence that the investigators began to gather in those first official actions would form the raw material of later argument. There were physical things to record, the position of the bodies as observed, small personal effects, clothing condition, and there were human things, testimony about movements, about what people had heard or failed to hear. Each element, physical or human, had to be weighed. Some elements would be straightforward. Who could attest to being in a room at a given time? Other elements would remain stubbornly ambiguous. How long ago did a person actually die? Within the limits of medical opinion at the time. There was also the question of motive, which in the days that followed would become a battleground. Financial arrangements, the management of property, and the nuances of family friction were all put on public display. The Bordens' private ledger of disputes, if such a ledger existed in formal terms, now became a matter for public inventory. Did Andrew's frugality and decisions about his estate provoke a deadly resentment? Was there a simple enrichment motive? Or was appetite for scandal amplifying ordinary family disagreements into criminal motive? These are the interpretive threads that prosecutors and defense attorneys alike would later pull at. But before lawyers took up those threads in court, the town would try, in the informal sense, to make sense of what had happened. People rewove stories at kitchen tables and in shop doorways. Those stories, while not legal evidence, mattered because they shaped public belief and could, indirectly, influence jurors and witnesses. In a legal system that relies as much on human persuasion as on material proof, the court of public opinion can be consequential. We end this portion of the narrative with the house as it had become by late afternoon, roped off in the public imagination if not yet by cordon, the scene of an event that would be carefully examined in the days to come. The ledger of daily life had been ripped open, its margins now filled with lines the family had not written. There would be formal scrutiny, an inquest, and then, inevitably, a trial. But those procedures follow a human rhythm: discovery, investigation, argument. What we have seen so far is the discovery and the first fumbling attempt to inventory what that discovery meant. In the next sequence, we will follow the inquest room's slow, precise labor, the sworn testimonies, the medical observations, and the early police steps calculated within the limits of 1892's investigative capacities. We will trace the manner in which small details, an overlooked letter, a cut on a hand, a broken piece of furniture, are turned into evidence, and how conflicting recollections produce a map of uncertainty that will be both the prosecution's challenge and the defense's opportunity. We will also begin to place the financial and social motives into a sharper archival frame, distinguishing what is recorded in living legal documents from what is rumor and supposition. For now, the house keeps its place in the public ledger, a tidy facade that concealed lethal interruptions, a set of thresholds that divided private life from public scrutiny. The question posed at the beginning remains the same, and it will remain the central axis of every attempt to explain that August morning. Did Lizzie Borden kill her parents? The answer, insofar as it can be reached, is woven out of evidence, testimony, and the cultural frames through which each was read. At this stage of the chronology, those strands are only beginning to be collected. Ledger, narrative device. Inquest, witnesses sworn, coroner, observations recorded, evidence list, being compiled, timelines, divergent, certainty, limited, indefinido, where precise minutes are concerned. The inquest convened under the somber discipline of procedure. Men who held civic roles, constables, medical officers, and lay jurors assigned to the coroner's panel, entered a house newly tragic and began the careful social work of turning shocked talk into sworn testimony. The inquest was not an adversarial trial. It was a fact-finding ritual that attempted to anchor impressions to signatures, to produce a paper trail that could be consulted later in the courthouse. Witnesses were called, one by one, to describe what they had seen, heard, or remembered. Their recollections, committed to ink and oath, would become the skeleton around which future narratives were draped. The maid, Bridget Sullivan, as she appears in most accounts, gave her recollection of the morning under oath. She had been recently employed in the house, and, like other servants of her class, would later find herself caught between private loyalty and public scrutiny. Her initial accounts and later testimony were scrutinized in part because servants' perceptions mattered greatly to how movement through the household could be reconstructed. Who had been in the parlor, who had left the house, who had opened doors. Yet her testimony, like every other, was a human account that could be read differently depending on a listener's expectations. Ledger, narrative device. Witness, maid, statement recorded, note, new employee, under pressure, memory subject to stress. Medical testimony at the inquest offered the blunt, constrained language of the period's physiology. The coroner and physicians described fatal wounds and offered estimates of the time range during which death likely occurred. Those estimates were inherently broad. Physicians of the era assessed rigor, body temperature, lividity, and the nature of injuries, but without modern methods that could narrow a post-mortem interval to narrow hours or minutes. When the coroner spoke of the nature of the blows, blunt force from a heavy implement, he used clinical terms, but could not always speak to the precise sequence of impact or to forensic minutiae that later generations would expect. For readers today, the coroner's findings supply necessary facts, the existence of fatal injuries, the general area of the body affected, but they fall short of an absolute map of action. Ledger, narrative device. Medical, wounds, described as multiple and severe. Time of death, estimated range indefinido. Instrument, described in contemporary reports as hatchet, chow axe-like. Exact object, indefinido. One of the most consequential elements the inquest generated was the formal recording of where each person had been during the crucial window of the morning. Because this case turns on opportunity as much as motive, the placement of persons in rooms, on porches, and in the street becomes the scaffolding of both accusation and defense. Witnesses placed Andrew in his downstairs private rooms, or the parlor at different moments. Others placed Lizzie in upstairs rooms. Still others reported seeing her outside or returning from errands. The testimony did not yield a consensus ready for the jury. Instead, it produced a web of overlapping, sometimes discordant accounts that scholars and armchair detectives have since tried to disentangle. That web included small but charged details. A torn garment, a speckle of blood, a broken piece of household furniture, a scrap of rag found in a pocket, a watch that stopped. Each of these was recorded with varying degrees of confidence. In the atmosphere of a house newly turned violent, these mundane things acquired significance. The prosecution would later catalogue them as clues. The defense would urge caution. These were common items in a lived house, not necessarily indicators of criminal action. Ledger, narrative device. Physical evidence entries. Clothing condition. Partial notes. Household items. Abrasive marks. Stains. Noted context indefinido. Investigative technique in 1892 relied as heavily on human testimony and immediate observation as on physical science. Detectives and constables took statements, sometimes in situ, and sometimes in a more controlled setting. They looked for motives they could narratively attach to the facts. Financial disputes, slights, complaints that had been prolonged into simmering resentments. They also sought practical traces, mud on boots, marks on doors, that might place an outsider at the scene. Their methods were professional by local standards, but rudimentary compared with forensic disciplines that would emerge over the 20th century. There was no DNA, no blood spatter analysis, no controlled laboratory testing of stains. There was paperwork, eyewitness testimony, and the capacity for a physician to testify about approximate times and the character of injuries. In such a context, the question of motive gained a heavier relative weight. People looked for reasons within the household's ledger. Who stood to gain financially? Who had clashed with Andrew over money or household management? Andrew Borden's well-known frugality and his control over family finances made the idea of money as a motive immediately available. There were documented disputes and noted patterns of behavior in which Andrew's decisions had engendered strain. The specific legal instruments, wills, deeds, and the precise content of estate plans would be examined later. But motive, even when plausible, remained an inference. The judicial standard required more than a good reason for wishful harm. The law demanded proof, and the proof available was, in many respects, ambiguous. Ledger, narrative device. Motive ledger, financial disputes, documented to an extent. Emotional grievances, reported in rumor. Direct link to killing, indefinido. The press continued to amplify every emerging detail. Newspapers printed not only facts but also character sketches, moral judgments, and speculative narratives that tended to harden into public opinion long before a jury deliberated. Reporters described the daughter's behavior with adjectives that carried cultural expectations of femininity and propriety. A composed face could be read as unnatural. A delayed outcry could be interpreted as calculated. The press's appetite for certainty sometimes displaced the patient work of evidence gathering. When the trial finally convened, jurors would not be blank slates. They would have been saturated with versions of the story, and the defense would later emphasize how pre-trial publicity could poison the well of fair judgment. Between inquest and arrest, investigators continued to collect statements and to attempt to narrow where the case might go. A puzzling element for contemporaries, and for many later observers, was the behavior attributed to Lizzie in the days following the discovery. She dressed and moved, according to many accounts, with an outward propriety that some found unnerving and others defended as decorum under duress. She took certain actions that would later become central to the prosecution's portrait. She received visitors. She engaged in routine household tasks. She was reported to have washed certain items. Each such act was susceptible to two readings, as the actions of a grieving daughter maintaining control, or as calculated behavior designed to obfuscate. In the court of public sentiment, those readings hardened quickly. In the court of law, the defense pressed the point that appearance is not proof. One specific set of facts that would occupy much of the argumentative space concerned items allegedly laundered or concealed. Reports that clothing had been rinsed or a dress burned had potent narrative force. A defense might ask, what other reasons for washing clothes exist in a home where heavy physical work is common? A prosecution might counter, why wash away the physical traces of a crime? The physical facts here, as recorded, were often ambiguous in technical terms. Stains could be blood or could be iron-rich water discoloration. A seam might show a repair unrelated to crime. Where the record is not precise, I mark the detail as indefinido. Ledger, narrative device. Household actions, washing, reported. Destroyed items, alleged in press. Exact record, indefinido. Interpretation, contested. On August 11, 1892, some days after the killings, an arrest occurred. The formal charge, when it came, transformed rumor into a formal accusation, and the machinery of prosecution began to prepare for trial. Arrest is a hinge in such cases. It signals the state's choice to move from investigation to charge. An arrest does not equal guilt. It is the commencement of a process designed to test evidence in a public forum. For Lizzie, the arrest would put her under intense legal and social pressure. For Fall River, it would turn private tragedy into a spectacle that, in many ways, defined the town's identity for decades to come. The months leading to trial were marked by legal preparation and a growing national interest. The case moved from local curiosity to national fascination because it combined elements that appealed widely. A respectable family disordered by domestic killing. A woman at the center of accusation at a time when gender expectations made such a role sensational, and the dramatic tableau of a neat household stained by violence. Lawyers on both sides prepared narratives, one that sought to connect household tensions and opportunity to the killings, another that insisted on the lack of direct physical evidence and sought to create reasonable doubt. The difference between the two would rest not only on facts, but on which narrative proved more credible to 12 jurors. Ledger, narrative device. Pre-trial, depositions compiled, legal strategy forming, public interest, expanding, jurors, to be selected from local rolls. When the trial finally convened the following year, the courtroom became the modern theater in which the ledger entries of the House were read aloud, examined, and contested. Opening statements framed the story in contrasting tones. The prosecution asserted motive and opportunity. The defense insisted on the insufficiency of proof and underscored the flaws in the investigative record. Witnesses, members of the household, neighbors, police, and medical officers, were called to reconstruct the scene. In the absence of conclusive forensic science, witness testimony and the plausibility of sequences were paramount. Prosecution strategy emphasized motive and behavioral inference. Prosecutors portrayed a narrative in which resentment, financial calculation, and access to the household converged to make a daughter a plausible suspect. They pointed to family disputes and to the proximity of the accused at crucial moments. They highlighted any evidence that suggested an attempt to conceal, to misdirect, or to sanitize the scene. In the public imagination, such a strategy fit easily. A traditionally controlled household, a frugal patriarch, daughters who conformed outwardly, these images produced a storyline that the press could easily amplify. The defense, in turn, depicted a different ledger, the absence of forensic linkage between the accused and the acts, the unreliability of certain witness recollections, the possibility of an outside assailant. Defense counsel relied on the presumption of innocence and sought to expose contradictory timelines and gaps in the prosecution's chain of inference. They argued that the state's narrative relied on inference and interpretation rather than on direct evidence. They worked to demonstrate that alternative explanations, including intruder hypotheses or misattributions of routine behavior, could account for the facts just as plausibly. Throughout the trial, certain pieces of testimony acquired outsized weight because of the cultural frames the jurors carried. Observations about the daughter's demeanor, reports of particular movements through the house, expert testimony that then-current medicine could provide. Cross-examination became the device by which the defense attempted to fracture testimony perceived as harmful. Where a witness had given inconsistent statements in the days after the crime, the defense highlighted those inconsistencies to suggest unreliability. The prosecution, conversely, sought through tone and accumulation to convince the jurors that the totality of the evidence pointed in one direction. Ledger, narrative device. Trial ledger, prosecution narrative. Motive, plus opportunity. Defense ledger, reasonable doubt, plus alternate explanations. Evidence, testimonial heavy, forensic light. It is worth pausing to consider the cultural pressure bearing on juries in such cases. Jurors sat as members of a community that had absorbed a massive wave of reporting and rumor. They were not neutral observers in a vacuum. They were neighbors and shoppers and voters. Some modern scholars suggest that such social embedding can both color jurors' initial expectations and make them more receptive to certain narratives. The defense's task in such circumstances is to return jurors to the standard of reasonable doubt, to insist that cultural conviction cannot replace material proof. When the jury retired, the community awaited a resolution that would not only determine legal responsibility, but would also reconcile the social ledger, who belonged to the community of reputable citizens and who was marked for suspicion. The verdict that returned, an acquittal, was a legal pronouncement that the state had failed to meet its burden. But acquittal did not collapse public curiosity. For many, the verdict did not equal exoneration in public judgment. For others, it confirmed the principle that conviction requires demonstrated fact, not conjecture. The discrepancy between legal outcome and public belief is one of the case's enduring features. Ledger, narrative device. Verdict, acquittal. Legal ledger, state failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Public ledger, divided. Some accept, some not. After the trial, life resumed in forms constrained by acquittal. The social ostracism of accused families is a familiar theme. An acquittal does not always reopen doors closed by suspicion. Lizzie, though not legally condemned, found her place in Fall River altered. She and Emma moved away from the house they had known. They faced a community that could not easily forget or forgive. The maid, too, carried the weight of public attention long after the courtroom emptied. The Borden house itself changed hands and in time became a site of curiosity. Its thresholds now perceptions in a narrative that the public revisited again and again. Over the decades, the case crystallized into legend. Nursery rhymes and simplified retellings reinforced an image of a daughter striking at home with a chopping instrument. The dynamics of such myth-making are predictable. Complex facts yield to clear images that are easy to remember and retell. The simplicity of the rhyme, chantable, memorable, made the story part of popular culture in a way that archival testimony never could. Museums and tours later commodified the house as a site of morbid fascination, and books, plays, and essays diversified the story into multiple interpretive genres: courtroom drama, psychological portrait, forensic puzzle. Ledger, narrative device. Cultural ledger, nursery rhyme, simplifies complexity. Public memory, myth grows. Modern reassessments have attempted to apply later forensic knowledge and socio-cultural analysis to the case. Contemporary forensic methods could, in theory, examine blood patterns, DNA remnants, and other material traces if such evidence had been preserved in a way that met modern chain-of-custody standards. But here we meet the hard limit of historical investigation. The original collection, preservation, and documentation of physical evidence were not conducted with the expectation of later reanalysis. Where objects were washed, preserved poorly, or destroyed, modern testing becomes impossible. Thus, a modern analyst might suggest scenarios consistent with known facts, but would often concede that these remain hypothetical reconstructions, not conclusive demonstrations. A forensic sidebar, in practical terms, reveals what could and could not be resolved. For example, modern blood pattern interpretation can sometimes suggest the relative position of attacker and victim during an assault, and can indicate whether an attacker likely used one hand or two, moved through the scene, or stood stationary. But such analyses require unaltered stains and careful documentation. Absent those, interpretations become speculative. Similarly, DNA analysis requires preserved biological material and a chain of custody that makes it admissible. In the Borden case, most material traces were handled in the manner typical of the era: immediate cleaning, domestic laundering, and informal storage that precludes reliable modern testing. Where a modern re-evaluation offers clarity, it often does so in doctrinal or theoretical ways, rather than by producing new forensic proof. Ledger, narrative device. Forensic reappraisal. Modern techniques useful only if original evidence preserved. Many items, unavailable or compromised. Conclusions, probabilistic, not definitive. Hypotheses about who committed the murders proliferate because the evidentiary record leaves room for them. They deserve to be laid out and weighed, each with its strengths and weaknesses. First, Lizzie as perpetrator. This hypothesis rests on three pillars often cited in prosecution narratives: motive, opportunity, and suspicious behavior. Motive is framed in the family ledger, financial disputes, control of household affairs, and the spectral threat of disinheritance. Opportunity is argued from her presence in the house and the house's arrangement, which allowed an insider to move between floors and manipulate thresholds with knowledge of domestic patterns. Behavior, washing, composure, certain statements, was read by some as evidence of concealment. The strength of this hypothesis is the plausibility that a household member with access could carry out such acts without raising immediate alarm. The weakness is the lack of direct physical linkage. No eyewitness to the actual act. No incontrovertible forensic trace connecting her body to the blows, and credible alternative scenarios that place her elsewhere at critical times. The legal record acknowledges these gaps, which is why an acquittal was returned. Second, intruder or outside assailant. This theory posits that an unknown person entered the house and killed the parents, either at random or with specific intent. Its strengths include the occasional testimony of neighbors who reported unusual comings and goings, or of items displaced that could be consistent with forced entry. The weakness is practical. The Borden house, by most accounts, did not show dramatic signs of forced entry. A violent pair of attacks committed by an outsider would risk detection in a relatively occupied neighborhood, and such an assailant would have needed to escape without leaving clear traces. Moreover, the intruder theory struggles to account for the concentration of victims within the household or for alleged evidence suggesting washing or concealment by a household member. Third, hired killer or accomplice. Some speculation imagines a paid agent entering the house. Logistically, this requires an outside party with motive to be contracted and with the capacity to enter and exit undetected. The strength of this hypothesis is that it removes direct culpability from household members. Its weakness is that it requires additional unproven links, payment, communication, and an outsider of sufficient skill, and again leaves little material proof in the historical record. Fourth, accidental or misattributed violence. Less dramatic, but not to be dismissed in historical method, is the possibility that the fatal events are misread fragments. A domestic altercation that escalated beyond expectation, an unavoidable accident couched later in criminal terms, or a sequence of events incorrectly reconstructed from imperfect testimony. These explanations ask us to consider the limits of perception in rapid, traumatic moments, and how a social ledger might quickly fill gaps with meaning. The weakness of this category is that multiple fatal blows to two different individuals are hard to reconcile with accidental scenarios. Yet the absence of clear evidence of a weapon linked to a specific hand complicates the placement of intent. Ledger, narrative device. Hypotheses. Ledger, Lizzie perpetrator. Intruder, hired killer. Accident, misattribution. Strengths and weaknesses recorded. No single theory decisive. Each hypothesis finds champions in different interpretive communities: historians, armchair detectives, forensic enthusiasts, and novelists. The case's cultural life feeds back into the evidence by shaping which questions are deemed important. This feedback loop, between cultural narrative and evidentiary focus, makes the Borden case a paradigmatic study in how stories persist when proof is elusive. Comparative context illuminates why the Borden case endured. The late 19th century saw numerous high-profile killings and evolving policing practices. Compared to many of its contemporaries, the Borden case mixed domestic respectability, female accusation, and a frugal, property-owning patriarch, elements that made it especially resonant. Police method in the era was improving, but not yet scientific. Local constabularies did what they could with witness statements and careful note-taking. In other cases, where physical evidence was better preserved, or where eyewitnesses existed, legal outcomes were more definitive. Where the Borden case differs is in the interplay of social expectation, how daughters were supposed to behave, and the limits of the era's tools. The aftermath of the trial is as much social as legal. Lizzie's acquittal did not restore communal acceptance. She and Emma left the family house. They lived under a cloud that the acquittal could not lift. The maid returned to a private life shadowed by public memory. The Borden house itself became a talking point and, over time, a destination. The process through which ordinary spaces become memorialized for violent events is a cultural phenomenon. Thresholds that once marked mundane domestic life become touristic thresholds of fascination. The house's transformation into a site that invites visitors to cross its thresholds is itself an entry in the ledger of how communities manage violent memory. Public memory shortened complexity into pithy forms, rhymes, sensational headlines, theatrical renderings. That process has ethical consequences. Reductive narratives strip victims, accused, and witnesses of nuance. They flatten motives into villainy or innocence into caricature. The historian's task, by contrast, is to preserve ambiguity where it exists, and to mark certainty only where evidence supports it. The Borden case is a reminder that some historical puzzles remain open, not because the question lacks interest, but because the available materials refuse to yield a single, clean explanation. Ledger, narrative device. Aftermath ledger, acquittal, social exile, cultural myth-making. What then should a modern reader make of the compiled materials? A careful answer begins with humility. The record is rich in texture, testimonies, press accounts, legal documents, but it is thin on the sort of physical proof contemporary eyes prize. The proper inference is probabilistic rather than dogmatic. Weigh motives, weigh proximity, weigh contradictions. Ask whether a hypothesis requires fewer or more assumptions to explain the known facts. When multiple plausible explanations remain, the historian's role is to lay them out and to indicate which portions of each are confirmed and which are speculative. Two methodological cautions are worth stating. First, narrative coherence is seductive. Humans prefer complete stories. Our minds are disposed to fit jagged facts into smooth arcs. It is a short step from narrative preference to the mistake of treating a well-formed story as equivalent to a proven one. Second, cultural expectations about gender, class, and comportment have historically shaped interpretations in ways that modern analysts sometimes fail to account for. What a 19th century community read as evidence of guilt may today be recognized as a gendered expectation about grief. Proper historical method requires separating the behavior observed from the meaning ascribed to it at the time. Scholarly work on the case continues to this day because the documents allow for new readings and because later theoretical tools, sociocultural analysis, forensic imagination, legal historical frameworks, can illuminate different facets. Some researchers focus on micro-timeline reconstruction, others on the social networks of Fall River, and still others on the press's rhetorical shaping of the accused. Each approach adds a ledger entry to the case's archival life. None as yet has closed the account. Ledger, narrative device. Research ledger. Archival work continues. New interpretations welcome. Hard physical proof remains elusive. There is also a moral ledger to be kept. The tendency to reduce historical persons to symbols dishonors the flesh and blood reality of their lives. Andrew and Abby, however they died, were people known to friends and acquaintances. Lizzie and Emma were daughters whose social fates shifted irrevocably. The maid and other household staff played roles that deserve sober attention beyond sensational headlines. A historical account that balances curiosity with respect remembers the humanity behind the names. The Borden case also raises perennial questions about how justice systems handle uncertainty. The principle enshrined in criminal law, that guilt must be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, functions as a societal hedge against punishing the innocent. Yet when evidence is ambiguous, public demand for moral clarity persists. Cases like the Borden murders expose the tension between legal standards and communal desire for closure. They demonstrate how sometimes a legal acquittal will not settle historical debate, and how sometimes the court of public opinion will continue to issue verdicts of its own. As a cultural artifact, the case offers insight into the late Victorian mind, its obsession with propriety, its anxieties about economic change, its fascination with domestic order disrupted by violence. The image of the tidy parlor overturned by crime resonated because it contravened a social script. Danger, in that era, was supposed to belong to the margins, not to the respectable center. The shock, then, was not merely of death but of disorder, a ledger unbalanced at its core. Ledger, narrative device. Cultural reading, Victorian anxieties, domestic order disrupted, spectacle of violence within respectability. Finally, we return to the house and the morning. Thresholds remain instructive, a stairwell that connects private rooms to public space. A parlor where visitors once sat. An upper room where a woman slept under a quilt. These are the plain geographies that, in their ordinariness, produce mystery when violence occurs. They are also the places where mundane habits, opening a door, setting a kettle, washing a garment, take on ethical significance in the retelling. The ledger image, repeated through this narrative, is apt because it captures the economizing impulse at play. People count assets and accusations. They reconcile accounts of behavior with accounts of motive. They tally what is known against what is uncertain. The Bordens kept ledgers of money, neighbors kept ledgers of gossip, and later generations have kept ledgers of theory and counter-theory. None of these has produced a single, incontestable entry that settles the question. So we return, at last, to the central question named at the outset. The Borden murders, 1892. Did Lizzie Borden kill her parents? The archival ledger offers reasons to suspect and reasons to doubt. It offers motive evidence, and it offers gaps. It offers behaviors that alarmed witnesses, and it offers the absence of physical proof that a court could accept for conviction. To state a categorical answer would be to overstep what the evidence presently supports. The responsible historical position is to acknowledge ambiguity, to weigh probabilities, and to make clear where facts are indefinido and where they are documented. Ledger, narrative device. Final ledger, evidence, mixed, verdict, acquittal. Historical certainty, unresolved. Interpretation, ongoing. If this story compels you, if the thresholds and ledgers and the silence between reported facts leave you inclined to lean one way or another, voice that inclination in the space this story occupies now. Share your theory in the comments and subscribe if you want more careful re-examinations of cases where law, culture, and forensic limits intersect. The Borden case will not yield a single tidy answer to those who demand one. It will continue instead to teach us about how communities account for violence and how we, as readers, balance narrative and proof. The house on that humid August morning kept its silence until it did not. The cry that broke it carried into a town conditioned to measure itself by order. The ledger entries left by the living are full of crossed-out lines and marginal notes. The margins are where doubt lives. What we can say with confidence is narrow. 2 people died violently in their home. Their family and community were forever altered. A trial failed to produce a conviction. What we cannot say with certainty, at least on the basis of the surviving record, is who struck the fatal blows. That absence of certainty is the case's persistent, haunting fact. Ledger, narrative device. Closure, legal verdict, acquittal. Historical verdict, unresolved. Invitation, readers to weigh the evidence. Consider the thresholds again, doorways, stairwells, the ledger on a household table, and ask what you would have seen if you had been a neighbor, a juror, a physician, or a maid that morning. The question is not merely forensic, it is moral and methodological. It asks how we construct truth amid imperfect records and how we remain attentive to the humanity of those whose names appear on our pages. If you have been following this account, take a moment to subscribe and leave your thoughts. Which ledger entry do you find most convincing? Which line do you find most doubtful? This is a question that has outlived the courtroom and continues to invite scrutiny. Because history, like a house, keeps its secrets in the thresholds where people once moved and in the margins where their accounts diverge.